There is a quiet theft taking place, so quiet in fact that most of us have mistaken it for the ordinary rhythm of life. We rise, we reach, we scroll, we glance, and somewhere between intention and action something slips away unnoticed. It is not taken by force, nor seized in some dramatic collapse of will, but surrendered in fragments, small, agreeable, almost invisible concessions. What is most troubling is not that our attention is being taken, but that we have grown willing participants in its disappearance, offering it freely to every passing distraction, while persuading ourselves that we remain in control. It is a curious thing that surrender rarely announces itself as such. We imagine it as a dramatic moment, a decisive yielding after struggle, but in truth it more often arrives clothed in comfort, in convenience, in the gentle suggestion that nothing of consequence is being lost. So it is with our attention. We do not feel it slipping away, we feel, instead, that we are merely passing time, filling gaps, easing the small discomforts of stillness. Yet beneath this harmless appearance lies a steady relinquishing, so gradual that it escapes our notice. The mind, left to its own proper order, seeks depth. It inclines toward meaning, toward sustained thought, toward the slow unfolding of understanding. But such inclinations require effort, and effort is precisely what our habits have been trained to avoid. In place of depth, we have grown accustomed to fragments, brief impressions, fleeting amusements, and a constant shifting from one object of interest to another. Each shift feels insignificant, almost trivial, but together they form a pattern, and the pattern reveals something more troubling, a willingness to be led rather than to lead. What makes this surrender particularly insidious is its subtlety. There is no clear moment at which one can say, "Here I have given something up." Instead, there is only a series of small permissions granted to distraction. A glance at a notification, a moment spent wandering through trivialities, a habit of reaching outward at the slightest hint of boredom, each one so minor that it seems unworthy of concern. And yet, these small acts accumulate. They shape the mind, not through force, but through repetition, until what was once a choice becomes a reflex, and what was once deliberate becomes automatic. It would be comforting to believe that such patterns are imposed upon us entirely from without, that we are merely the victims of a world designed to capture and hold our attention. But this is only part of the truth, and perhaps not the most important part. For the greater danger lies not in what is offered, but in how readily we accept it. We are not dragged into distraction against our will, we drift into it, often with a kind of quiet consent. We welcome the interruption because it relieves us of the burden of sustained thought, because it provides an easy alternative to the discipline of focus. There is, in this, a certain irony. We often speak as though attention were something we possess securely, something that can be directed at will whenever we choose. Yet the evidence of our daily habits suggests otherwise. If we were truly in command, we would not find ourselves so easily diverted, so quickly drawn away from what we had intended to do. The fact that we are, time and again, reveals that our control is less firm than we suppose, and that our attention is far more vulnerable than we are inclined to admit. And so the surrender continues not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, repeated acts of giving way. It is a process that does not demand our awareness, only our participation. Indeed, it thrives precisely because it remains unnoticed, because it blends so seamlessly into the fabric of ordinary life. By the time we begin to question it, much has already been given over, and the habit of surrender has grown so familiar that it feels almost natural, as though it were simply the way things are meant to be. There is a peculiar comfort in believing that we are always choosing, that each turn of our attention is guided by preference and governed by will. It flatters us to suppose that we stand at the center of our actions, directing them with quiet authority. Yet this belief begins to falter when we examine more closely the nature of our daily movements. How quickly we turn, how often we drift, how little resistance we offer to the next available diversion. What we call choice, in many cases, bears a striking resemblance to something far less deliberate. For a true choice requires a moment of pause, a recognition of alternatives, and a willingness to accept the cost of one path over another. It demands, in other words, a certain steadiness of mind. But what commonly passes for choice in the realm of attention is altogether more hurried and less examined. We do not so much weigh options as we respond to prompts. A sound, a flash, a suggestion appears and we follow it, not because we have judged it worthy, but because it has presented itself with sufficient immediacy to displace whatever came before. This displacement is so swift that it often escapes notice. One moment there is intention, the next there is interruption, and the transition between the two is scarcely felt. If questioned, we might say that we chose to turn aside, but such a claim rests more on assumption than on observation. The truth is that many of these shifts occur before any conscious deliberation has taken place. They are not decisions in the full sense, but reactions, reflexive movements shaped by habit and expectation. Over time, these reactions begin to take on the appearance of freedom. Because we encounter a variety of options, we conclude that we are freely selecting among them. Yet variety alone does not constitute liberty. One may move from one distraction to another and still remain unfree, just as one may wander through many rooms without ever leaving the house. The presence of alternatives can conceal the absence of control, especially when each alternative serves the same underlying pattern of diversion. There is also the subtle influence of design, though it often operates beneath the threshold of awareness. Many of the things that seek our attention are arranged in such a way as to invite immediate engagement. They do not demand reflection, they discourage it. Their appeal lies precisely in their ease, in the absence of any barrier that might slow us down long enough to reconsider. In such an environment, the act of not engaging begins to feel like effort, while the act of giving in appears natural, almost inevitable. Yet even here, it would be mistaken to place the entire weight of responsibility on what lies outside us. The design may invite, but it does not compel. The more decisive factor remains our readiness to accept the invitation without question. We have grown accustomed to a state in which the slightest impulse is granted authority, in which the mere presence of an option is treated as sufficient reason to pursue it. This habit weakens the very faculty that would allow us to distinguish between what is merely available and what is genuinely worthwhile. It is not that we have lost the capacity to choose, but that we have allowed it to lie dormant. The distinction between acting and reacting becomes blurred, and with it our sense of agency grows uncertain. We continue to move, to engage, to consume, all the while assuming that these movements are expressions of our will. Yet when examined with care, many of them reveal themselves to be guided less by intention than by momentum, less by judgment than by the quiet pressure of what happens to be placed before us. There is a subtle transformation that takes place when an action is repeated often enough. What begins as a conscious decision, made with some measure of intention, gradually loses its sharpness of awareness. The edges soften, the effort diminishes, and in time the action proceeds almost of its own accord. This is what we commonly call habit, and in itself it is not a fault, for much of life depends upon such patterns. Without them, even the simplest tasks would demand an exhausting degree of attention. Yet there is a distinction to be made between habits that serve intention and those that quietly replace it. At first, the difference is hardly noticeable. One checks a message, glances at a screen, or turns aside for a moment of diversion. Each instance appears harmless, easily justified as a small pause in the course of a larger purpose. But repetition carries a force of its own. The act once occasional becomes familiar, the familiar becomes expected, and what is expected begins to occur without the need for conscious approval. In this way, the mind grows accustomed to certain movements, and these movements begin to assert themselves, even when they are neither needed nor desired. It is here that habit ceases to be merely a convenience and becomes something more directive. Instead of supporting intention, it begins to anticipate it, and in some cases to override it entirely. A person may sit down with a clear aim, only to find themselves diverted almost immediately by a pattern that has taken root beneath the surface. The hand moves before the thought is fully formed. The attention shifts before any deliberate consent has been given. What was once chosen now presents itself as if it were inevitable. This transition is seldom accompanied by any sense of alarm. Indeed, it often passes without recognition, precisely because it does not feel like a loss. The actions themselves remain familiar, even agreeable, and so there is little reason to question them. Yet beneath this familiarity lies a quiet displacement. The role of intention is reduced, its authority gradually diminished, until it no longer governs the course of action, but merely observes it, occasionally attempting to intervene, often without success. There is also a certain economy in habit that makes it particularly persuasive. It spares us the effort of deciding, the strain of sustained focus, the discomfort of resisting immediate impulses. In a world that continually presents new stimuli, this economy becomes all the more appealing. To act without thinking seems easier than to think before acting, and so the path of least resistance becomes the path most often taken. But ease in this sense comes at a cost. The more we rely on automatic responses, the less we exercise the very capacities that allow us to direct ourselves with clarity and purpose. Over time, this reliance reshapes the inner life. The mind becomes less accustomed to holding a single line of thought, less capable of resisting interruption, more inclined to follow whatever presents itself most readily. Intention, though not entirely lost, finds itself weakened by disuse, like a muscle that has not been called upon to perform its proper function. The result is not a dramatic collapse of will, but a gradual erosion, so subtle that it may go unnoticed until its effects are firmly established. and so the pattern continues, reinforced by each repetition, strengthened by each unexamined act. What once required a decision now proceeds without one, and what once depended upon intention now persists in its absence. The mind moves along well-worn paths, guided less by deliberate choice than by the quiet momentum of habit, which has come to occupy a place that was never meant to be entirely its own. There is a certain satisfaction in believing oneself to be in control. It lends a sense of order to life, a quiet assurance that one's actions proceed from deliberate choice rather than from chance or influence. We like to imagine that our thoughts obey us, that our attention moves where we direct it, and that our decisions arise from some stable center within. Yet this confidence, though comforting, is not always well examined, and it may conceal more than it reveals. For control in its true sense is not measured by what we intend, but by what we are able to sustain. It is one thing to decide upon a course of action, and quite another to remain upon it when competing impulses present themselves. The difficulty lies not in forming intentions, but in maintaining them against the steady pressure of distraction, habit, and impulse. If we attend closely to our own experience, we may find that this maintenance is far less secure than we had supposed. The illusion begins, perhaps, with the ease of making small decisions. We choose what to look at, what to listen to, what to engage with, and these choices create the impression of agency. Because we are not being compelled by any visible force, we conclude that we are acting freely. Yet the absence of compulsion is not the same as the presence of control. One may act without being forced and still be guided by influences that operate quietly beneath awareness. There is also the matter of interruption, which reveals much about the limits of our authority. A person may set out with a clear intention, only to be diverted within moments by something entirely incidental. The diversion is often accepted without resistance, as though it were of equal importance to the original aim. If control were as firm as we believe, such interruptions would be rare or easily dismissed. The fact that they are neither suggests that our hold on our own attention is more fragile than we care to admit. What is particularly deceptive is that these lapses do not feel like failures. We do not experience them as losses of control, but as ordinary shifts in activity. The mind moves, and we move with it, seldom pausing to ask whether the movement was chosen or merely allowed. In this way, the distinction between directing and following becomes blurred. We continue to act, to engage, to respond, all the while assuming that these actions are expressions of our will. There is, however, a difference between having the capacity for control and exercising it. The former remains intact even when neglected, but the latter depends upon use. Just as a faculty of thought may weaken if it is not employed, so too may the faculty of self-direction diminish when it is rarely called upon. We may still possess the ability to govern our attention, but if we seldom require it to do so, we should not be surprised to find it less responsive when we finally attempt to assert it. This is not to suggest that control is entirely absent, but rather that it is often overstated. We operate within a mixture of intention and influence, of decision and habit, of awareness and automatic response. To recognize this is not to abandon the idea of control, but to place it on firmer ground. For it is only when we see clearly the extent of our vulnerability that we may begin to understand what genuine control would require. And so the illusion persists, sustained by the appearance of choice and the absence of obvious constraint. We continue to regard ourselves as the authors of our attention, even as it is repeatedly drawn away from our stated aims. The mind, in its movements, gives the impression of freedom, yet these movements often follow patterns that have been established without deliberate consent, leaving us to wonder, if only briefly, whether we are truly directing our course or merely accompanying it. There is a tendency in the mind, when left unguarded, to divide itself into ever smaller portions of attention. It moves not steadily from one object to another, but in restless intervals, touching briefly here and there, never remaining long enough to settle into any one place. At first, this manner of engagement appears efficient, even necessary, as though by distributing our attention across many things we might somehow gain more from each. Yet what often results is not an increase of understanding, but a dilution of it. For attention, unlike many other faculties, does not multiply by division. It deepens by continuity. When it is held upon a single line of thought, it gathers strength, much like a current that grows more forceful when confined to a narrow course. But when it is scattered, moving rapidly from one point to another, it loses this force. Each shift interrupts the formation of coherence, leaving behind fragments that do not easily join into anything substantial. This fragmentation has consequences that are not immediately apparent. The mind may feel active, even busy, yet its activity lacks direction. Thoughts begin, but they do not fully develop. Ideas appear, but they are quickly displaced before they can be examined. In such a state, One may have the impression of engagement without the substance of it, as though one were continually approaching understanding without ever arriving at it. There is also an effect upon the will, though it is more subtle still. The ability to sustain attention is closely bound to the ability to persist in action. When the mind grows accustomed to frequent shifts, it becomes less inclined to endure the steady effort required for deeper work. What demands patience begins to feel burdensome, not because it is beyond our capacity, but because we have trained ourselves to expect constant variation. The will, finding itself unsupported by a stable attention, begins to weaken in its resolve. It would be easy to attribute this condition entirely to the abundance of stimuli that surround us, to the many calls upon our awareness that arrive from without. Yet such an explanation, while partly true, does not reach the heart of the matter. The more significant change occurs within. We have grown receptive to interruption, even welcoming of it. What might once have been resisted is now accepted without question, and the mind, having adapted to this pattern, begins to seek it out of its own accord. There is, in this, a quiet alteration of expectation. Stillness comes to feel unnatural, sustained focus unfamiliar. The absence of immediate stimulation is mistaken for a lack of purpose, and so we turn away from it, not realizing that it is precisely in such moments that attention might recover its strength. Instead, we continue to divide it, offering small portions to many things, until there is not enough gathered in any one place to produce clarity. Over time, this pattern reshapes the way we think. The mind becomes more adept at scanning than at considering, more comfortable with surfaces than with depth. It learns to move quickly, but not to remain, and in losing the habit of remaining, it loses something essential to understanding. For understanding is not merely the recognition of information, but the result of sustained engagement with it, a process that cannot be hurried without being diminished. Thus, what appears at first as a harmless distribution of attention reveals itself, upon closer inspection, as a steady weakening of its power. The mind continues to move, to encounter, to respond, yet it does so in fragments, rarely gathering itself into a whole, and in this fragmentation, the strength that comes from unity is quietly set aside. There comes a point at which the loss, though gradual and long unnoticed, begins to suggest the possibility of recovery, not through sudden resolve or a single act of determination, but through the quiet recognition that what has been given away may, in part, be taken back. Yet this recognition alone is insufficient, for the difficulty lies not merely in seeing the condition, but in altering the habits that sustain it. To reclaim authority over the mind is not to make a declaration, but to undertake a discipline that runs counter to the ease we have grown accustomed to. The first obstacle is often the expectation of immediacy. We are inclined to think that, having noticed the problem, we should at once correct it, as though the mind were an instrument that need only be adjusted to return to proper function. But the patterns that have been formed through repetition do not yield so readily. They persist not out of defiance but out of familiarity. What has been practiced becomes natural, and what is natural resists change, even when the change is desired. To regain authority, one must begin in smaller ways than one might prefer. It is not a matter of mastering attention in its entirety, but of directing it, however briefly, with intention. A moment of sustained focus, deliberately held, stands in quiet opposition to the habit of constant shifting. It may seem insignificant, almost too small to matter, yet it marks a departure from automatic response. In that moment, the mind is not merely moving, it is being guided. There is also a need to reconsider the place of discomfort. Much of what leads us into distraction arises from a reluctance to remain with what is not immediately pleasing or easy. We turn away from effort, from stillness, from the slow unfolding of thought, and in doing so, we reinforce the very patterns we seek to escape. To remain even briefly with such discomfort is to challenge the expectation that every moment must provide immediate satisfaction. It is to assert that attention need not be governed by impulse alone. This process requires a kind of patience that is easily overlooked. Progress is not measured by the absence of distraction, but by the manner in which we respond to it. The mind will continue to wander, habits will continue to assert themselves. The difference lies in whether these movements are followed without question or gently redirected. Each return, however small, strengthens the capacity for direction, while each unexamined drift allows the old patterns to persist. It would be mistaken to suppose that such efforts must be severe or burdensome. Authority over the mind does not arise from force, but from consistency. It is established not through sudden intensity, but through repeated acts of attention, each one reinforcing the next. In this way, a new pattern begins to form, not by erasing the old at once, but by gradually taking its place. There is also a shift in perception that accompanies this change. What once appeared as a constant demand for engagement begins to lose some of its urgency. The mind, having experienced moments of steadiness, becomes less inclined to pursue every passing distraction. It learns slowly that not all impulses require response, and that there is a difference between what calls for attention and what merely seeks it. And so the work continues, not as a single effort, but as an ongoing practice. The authority that has been diminished is not restored in an instant, but rebuilt through use, through the repeated choice to direct rather than to drift. It is a quiet work, often unnoticed by others, yet it shapes the inner life in ways that extend far beyond the moments in which it is exercised.